Welcome to Leaping Larry's Revolutionary Reading Theatre.
Okay, comrades, today we are continuing on our read of Michael Parenti's Blackshirts and Reds. Are there any actual good YouTube channels besides yours on DPRK? DPRK Explained is really good. Highly recommend DPRK Explained. That's the one we watched this morning that talked about how their education system works. We're gonna watch them every morning from now on. Okay, Marge, good night, comrade. Thank you for coming. Silver Spook, so great to see you. Everybody, follow our comrade, please. Silver Spook. There it is. Fill in that heart at the top of your screen. Welcome in, Silver Spook. We're just about to read from Michael Parenti's Blackshirts and Reds for the comrades here. Doing a little bit of USSR debunking. So today we're on chapter 7. The free market paradise goes east. Hey, Noam Chomsky, welcome, welcome. This is the free market paradise goes east part 2, actually. So I like this one even more than the last chapter. This one is going to talk to more everyday workers and stuff that were involved in this process, or that experience this process. And make sure you're following my cousin, Silver Spook, Juche Gang Orders. And check out our video on YouTube as well. We had a great discussion. We'll have to do another meeting of the minds soon, Spook. That was great. Alright, Free Market Paradise Goes East, Part 2. Free market propagandists in the former communist countries claim that, as capital was privatized and accumulated in a few hands, production would be stimulated and prosperity would be at hand. But first, there would be a difficult period to go through. The difficult period is proving to be far more severe and protracted than predicted, and may well be the permanent condition of capitalist restoration. The Vipers and Bloodsuckers. In 1990, as the Soviet Union was preparing for its fatal plunge into the free market paradise, Bruce Gleb, head of the United States Information Agency, told a reporter that the Soviets would benefit economically from U.S. business education because, quote, the Vipers, the Bloodsuckers, the middlemen, that's what needs to be rehabilitated in the Soviet Union. That's what makes our kind of country click. Washington Post, 6/11/1990. Today, the former communist countries are clicking away with Vipers and Bloodsuckers. Yeah, I'm omitting that other thing. Thousands of luxury cars have appeared on the streets of Moscow and Prague. Rents and real estate prices have skyrocketed. Numerous stock exchanges have sprung up in China and Eastern Europe, 16 in the former USSR alone. And a new class of investors, speculators, and racketeers are wallowing in wealth. The professed goal is no longer to provide a better life for all citizens, but to maximize the opportunities for individuals to accumulate personal fortunes. More opulence for the few creates more poverty for the many. As one young female journalist in Russia put it, quote, every time someone gets richer, I get poorer. New York Times, 10/15/1995. In Russia, the living standard of the average family has fallen almost by half since the market reforms took hold. New York Times, 6/16/1996. A report from Hungary makes the same point. Quote, while the new rich live in villas with a Mercedes parked in their garage, the number of poor people has been growing. Unquote. New York Times, 2/27/1990. As socialist Vietnam opens itself up to foreign investment, and the free market gaps between rich and poor have widened rapidly, and the quality of education and healthcare for the poor has deteriorated. New York Times, 4/8/96. Prosperity has come only to a privileged few in Vietnam, leading to an emerging class structure that is at odds with the country's professed egalitarian ideals. AP Report, 10/28/1996. In the emerging free market paradise of Russia and Eastern Europe, price deregulation produced not competitive prices, but prices set by private monopolies, adding to the galloping inflation. Beggars, pimps, dope pushers, and other hustlers ply their trades as never before, and there has been a dramatic rise in unemployment, homelessness, air and water pollution, prostitution, social abuse, child abuse, and just about every other social ill. In countries like Russia and Hungary, as widely reported in the US press, the suicide rate has climbed by 50% in a few years. Reductions in fuel service, brought about by rising prices and unpaid bills, have led to a growing number of deaths or serious illnesses among the poor and the elderly during the long winters. In Russia, doctors and nurses in public clinics are now grossly underpaid. Free health clinics are closing. More than ever, hospitals suffer from unsanitary conditions and shortages of disposal syringes, needles, vaccines, and modern equipment. Many hospitals now have no hot water, some no water at all. The deterioration of immunization programs and health standards has allowed polio to make a serious comeback, along with tuberculosis, cholera, diphtheria, dysentery, and sexually transmitted diseases. Drug addiction has risen sharply. Quote, Russia's hospitals are struggling to treat increasing number of addicts with decreasing levels of funding. CNN News Report 2/2/92. There has been a decline in nutritional levels and a sharp increase in stress and illness. Yet the number of visits to doctors has dropped by half because fees are so costly in the newly privatized healthcare systems. As a result, many illnesses go undetected and untreated until they become critical. Russian military officials describe the health of conscripts as catastrophic. Within the armed forces, suicides have risen dramatically, and deaths from drug overdoses have climbed 80% in recent years. Toronto Star, 11/5/1995. The overthrow of communism brought a rising infant mortality and soaring death rates in Russia, Bulgaria, Hungary, Latvia, Moldavia, Romania, Hungary, Ukraine, Mongolia, and East Germany. Sorry, I said Hungary twice there. 1/3 of Russian men never live to 60 years of age. In 1992, Russia's birth rate fell below its death rate for the first time since World War II. In 1992 and 1993, East Germans buried 2 people for every baby. The death rate rose nearly 20% for East German women in their late 30s, and nearly 30% for men of the same age. New York Times, 4/6/1994. With the end of subsidized rents, estimates of homelessness in Moscow alone run as high as 300,000. The loss of resident permits deprives the homeless of medical care and other state benefits, such as they are. Dressed in rags and victimized by both mobsters and government militia, thousands of indigents die of cold and hunger on the streets of various cities. In Romania, thousands of homeless children live in sewers and train stations, sniffing glue to numb their hunger, begging and falling prey to various predators. National Public Radio News, 7/21/1996. In Mongolia, hundreds of homeless children live in the sewers of Ulaanbaatar. Before 1990, Mongolia was a prosperous nation that had benefited from Soviet and East European financial assistance and technical aid. Its new industrial centers produced leather goods, woolen products, textiles, cement, meat, grain, and timber. Quote, the communist era dramatically improved the quality of life of the people, achieving commendable levels of social development through state-sponsored social welfare measures. But free market privatization and deindustrialization has brought unemployment, mass poverty, and widespread malnutrition to Mongolia. Shock therapy for the many. Unemployment rates has risen as high as 30% in countries that once knew full employment under communism. One Polish worker claims that the jobless are pretty much unemployable after age 40. Polish women say economic demise comes earlier for them, since to get a job, as one puts it, you must be young, childless, and have a big bosom. Nation, 12/7/1992. Occupational safety is now almost non-existent, and workplace injuries and deaths have drastically increased. Workers now toil harder and longer for less, often in sweatshop conditions. Hate that term. Teachers, scientists, factory workers, and countless others struggle for months without pay as their employers run out of funds. Los Angeles Times, 1/17/1996. The waves of strikes and work stoppages in Russia and Eastern Europe are accorded unsympathetic press treatment in those countries. Even in the few remaining countries in which communist governments retain control, such as China, Vietnam, and Cuba, the opening to private investment has contributed to a growing inequality. And what has forced that to happen? In Cuba, the dollar economy has brought with it a growth in prostitution, including girls as young as 11 and 12, street beggars, and black market dealings with tourists. Evie Chomsky, Cuba Update 9/96. In China, there are workers who now put in 12 to 16 hours a day for subsistence pay without regularly getting a day off. Those who protest against poor safety and health conditions risk being fined or jailed. The market reforms in China have also brought a return to child labor. San Francisco Chronicle, 8/14/90. I think this is what happens when you have private companies, says Miss Peng, a young migrant who has doubts about the new China. In private companies, you know, the workers don't have rights. Wall Street Journal, 5/19/1994. Throughout Eastern Europe, unions have been greatly weakened or broken. Sick leave, maternity leave, paid vacations, and other job benefits once taken for granted under communism have been cut or abolished. Worker sanitariums, vacation resorts, health clinics, sports, and cultural centers, children's nurseries, daycare centers, and other features that made communist enterprises more than just workplaces have nearly vanished. Rest homes, formerly reserved for workers, have been privatized and turned into casinos, nightclubs, and restaurants for the nouvelle riche. Real income has shrunk by as much as 30 to 40% in ex-communist countries. In 1992 alone, Russia saw its consumer spending drop by 38%. By comparison, during the Great Depression, consumer spending in the United States fell 21% over 4 years. Jesus. In both Poland and Bulgaria, an estimated 70% now live below or just above the poverty line. In Russia, it is 75 to 85%, with a third of the population barely subsisting in absolute economic desperation. In Hungary, which has received most of the West's investments in Eastern Europe, over one third of its citizens live in abject poverty, and 70% of the men hold two or more jobs, working up to 14 hours a day, according to the Ministry of Labor. After months of not getting paid, coal miners in far eastern Russia were beginning to starve. By August 1996, 10,000 of them had stopped working simply because they were too weak from hunger. With no coal being extracted, the region's power plants began to shut down, threatening an electrical blackout that would further harm the nation's Pacific coastal industry and trade. Los Angeles Times, 8/3/1996. Eastern Europeans are witnessing scenes, quote, that are commonplace enough in the West, but are still wrenching here. The old man rummaging through trash barrels for castaway items. The old woman picking through a box of bones at a meat market in search of the one with enough gristle to make a thin soup. Los Angeles Times, 3/10/1990. With their savings and pensions swallowed up by inflation, elderly pensioner crowd the sidewalks of Moscow, selling articles of their clothing and other pathetic wares, while enduring harassment by police and thugs. Washington Post, 1/1/1996. A Russian senior citizen refers to, quote, this poverty which only a few have escaped, while some have become wildly rich. Modern Maturity, September-October 1994. Crime and corruption. With the socialist ethic giving way to private greed, corruption assumed virulent new forms in the post-communist nations. Officials high and low are on the take, including the police. The Russian security minister calculated that 1/3 of Russian oil and 1/2 of Russian nickels shipped out of the country was stolen. Among those enjoying staggering profits from this plunder were Shell Oil and British Petroleum. Washington Post, 2/2/1993. In April 1992, the chairman of Russia's central bank admitted that at least $20 billion had been illegally taken out of the country and deposited in Western banks. The Nation, 4/19/1993. Choice chunks of public real estate are quietly sold off at a fraction of their value in exchange for payoffs to the officials who preside over the sales. Government officials buy goods from private contractors at twice the normal price in exchange for kickbacks. Factory directors sell state-made commodities at low state prices to their own private firms, which those firms then resell at market prices for a vast profit. One member of the Moscow City Council estimated that corruption amounted to hundreds of billions of dollars. If these funds went into state coffers instead of private pockets, we could meet our budget 3 or 4 times over. Los Angeles Times, 7/10/1992. Along with corruption, there is an upsurge in organized crime. Over 100 racket syndicates in Russia now extort tribute from 80% of all enterprises. From 1992 to 1995, as competition for the spoils of reform intensified, 46 of Russia's more prominent businessmen were slain in gangland-style murders. In 1994, there were more than 2,500 contract murders, almost all of them unsolved. Contract murders occur regularly now in Russia, and most go without much notice. San Francisco Chronicle, 11/17/1995. Police say they lack the funds, personnel, and crime detection equipment for any real campaign against the mobs. Street crime has also increased sharply. New York Times, 5/7/1996. In the former Soviet Union, women and elderly who once felt free to sit in parks late at night now dare not venture out after dark. Since the overthrow of communism in Hungary, thefts and other felonies have nearly tripled, and there has been a 50% increase in homicides. NPR, 2/24/1992. The police force in Prague today is many times greater than it was under communism when, quote, relatively few police were needed, unquote. New York Times, 12/18/1991. How odd that fewer police were needed in the communist police state than the free market paradise. Perhaps there's something they're not telling us there. In the Republic of Georgia, life has been reduced to a level of violent chaos never imagined under communism. Criminal rings control much of the commerce, and paramilitary groups control most of the criminal rings. No longer able to sell its goods on the Soviet market, but unable to compete on the international market, Georgian industry has experienced a massive decline, and, as in most Eastern countries, the public debt has leaped upward while real wages have shrunk painfully. San Francisco Chronicle, 7/20/1993. Cultural decay. Cultural life has drastically declined in the former communist countries. Theaters are sparsely attended because tickets are now prohibitively expensive. Publicly owned movie industries in countries like Russia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the German Democratic Republic, which produced a number of worthwhile films, have been defunded or bought out by Western business interests and now make cartoons, commercials, and music videos. Movie houses have been taken over by corporate chains that offer many of the same Hollywood junk films that we have the freedom to see. Subsidies for the arts and literature have been severely cut. Symphony orchestras have disbanded or taken to playing at block parties and other minor occasions. The communist countries used to produce inexpensive but quality editions of classical, contemporary authors and poets, including ones from Latin America, Asia, and Africa. These have been replaced by second-rate, mass-market publications from the West. During the communist era, 3 of every 5 books in the world were produced in the Soviet Union. Today, as the cost of books, periodicals, and newspapers has skyrocketed and education has declined, readership has shrunk almost to third world levels. Books of a Marxist or otherwise critical left perspective have been removed from bookstores and libraries. In East Germany, the Writers Association reported one instance in which 50,000 tons of books, some brand new, were buried in a dump. The German authorities who disposed of the books apparently did not quite feel free enough to burn them. Education, once free, is now accessible only to those who can afford the costly tuition fees. The curricula have been depoliticized, meaning that a left perspective, critical of imperialism and capitalism, has been replaced by a conservative one that is supportive or at least uncritical of these forces. Descending upon the unhappy societies of Eastern Europe and Russia are the Hare Krishnas, Mormons, Moonies, Jehovah's Witnesses, Baha'is, rightist Christian evangelicals, self-improvement hucksters, instant success peddlers, and other materialistic spiritualist scavengers who prey upon the deprived and the desperate, offering solace in the next world or the promise of wealth and success in this one. The president of one of Russia's largest construction companies summed it up. Quote, all the material wealth All the material well-being that people had, they lost in 1 hour. There is no practicality, no more free medical care, no accessible higher education, no right to a job or rest. The houses of culture, libraries, stadiums, kindergartens, and nurseries, pioneer camps, schools, hospitals, and stores are closing. The cost of housing, communal services, and transport are no longer affordable for the majority of families. Unquote. People's Weekly World, 4/6/1996. Facing forced privatization, news and entertainment media have had to find rich owners, corporate advertisers, conservative foundations, or agencies within the newly installed capitalist governments to finance them. Television and radio programs that had left perspective, including some popular youth shows, have been removed from the air. All media have been purged of leftist and restaffed by people with acceptable ideological orientations. This process of moving towards a pro-capitalist communication monopoly has been described in the Western media as democratization. Billboards and television commercials promoting US cigarettes, automobiles, and other consumer items, many of them beyond the average pocketbook, now can be seen everywhere. Women and children last. The overthrow of communism has brought a sharp increase in gender inequality. The new constitution adopted in Russia eliminates provisions that guaranteed women the right to paid maternity leave, job security during pregnancy, prenatal care, and affordable daycare centers. Without the former communist stipulation that women get at least 1/3 of the seats in any legislature, female political representation has dropped to as low as 5% in some countries. In all communist countries, about 90% of women had jobs in what was a full employment economy. Today, women compose over 2/3 of the unemployed. Yeah, socialism, communism is feminism. Proof is in the pudding. Those who do work are being channeled into low-pay, unskilled positions. Women are being driven from the professions in disproportionate numbers and are advised against getting professional training. More than 30% of unemployed females are skilled workers and professionals who previously earned higher salaries than the national norm. The loss of maternity benefits and child care services has created still greater obstacles to female employment. Throughout the Eastern European nations, the legal, financial, and psychological independence that women enjoyed under socialism has been undermined. Divorce, abortion, and birth control are more difficult to obtain. Released from the Soviet yoke, the autonomous region in Ingushetia decriminalized polygamy and made it legal for women to be sold into marriage. Instances of sexual harassment and violence against women have increased sharply.
Put money into education, not prisons.
In Russia, the number of women murdered annually, primarily by husbands and boyfriends, skyrocketed from 5,300 to 15,000 in the first 3 years of the free market paradise. In 1994, an additional 57,000 women were seriously injured in such assaults. These official figures understate the level of violence. The Communist Party committees that used to intervene in cases of domestic abuse no longer exist. Women are also being recruited in unprecedented numbers for the booming sex industry that caters to foreign and domestic businessmen. Unable to find employment in their professions for which they were originally trained, many highly educated Russian and Eastern European women go abroad to work as prostitutes. Women are not the only ones being channeled into a sex market, as reported in Newsweek in 9/2/1996. Prague and Budapest now rival Bangkok and Manila as hubs for the collection of children to serve visiting pedophiles. Last year, one investigator was stunned to find stacks of child pornography in the reception rooms of Estonia's parliament. And its social welfare department, quote, free love is regarded as one of the new freedoms which the market economy can offer, she wrote. Simultaneously, sex in the market economy has also become a profitable commodity. In some cases, children are kidnapped and held like slaves, says Thomas Cato, a specialist with the Council of Europe. This is happening more and more. It is organized crime. Unquote. Life conditions for children have deteriorated greatly throughout the ex-communist world. Free summer camps have been closed down. School lunches, once free or low-priced, are now too costly for many pupils. Hungry children constitute a serious school problem. Instead of attending classes, children can be found hawking drinks or begging in the streets. Juvenile crime is booming along with juvenile prostitution, while funds for youth rehabilitation services dwindle. Los Angeles Times, 7/15/1994. The revolution that feeds the fucking children. You know? And the process and the vipers and the villains that try and stop that process from happening get our undiluted hate and our undiluted animosity. We didn't realize what we had. While many Eastern European intellectuals remain fervent champions of the free market paradise,
the revolution that feeds the children gets my support.
Most workers and peasants no longer romanticize capitalism, having felt its unforgiving lash. We didn't realize what we had has now become a common refrain. The latest public opinion surveys show that many Russians consider Brezhnev's era and even Stalin's era to have been better than the present day period, at least as far as economic conditions and personal safety are concerned. New York Times, 10/15/1995. A joke circulating in Russia in 1992 went like this. Question: what did capitalism accomplish in 1 year that communism could not do in 70 years? Answer: make communism look good. Throughout Eastern Europe and the former USSR, many people begrudgingly admit that conditions were better under communism. New York Times, 3/30/1995. Pro-capitalist Angela Stent of Georgetown University allows that, quote, most people are worse off than they were under communism. The quality of life has deteriorated with the spread of crime and the disappearance of the social safety net. New York Times, 12/20/1993. An East German steelworker is quoted as saying, quote, I do not know if there is a future for me, and I'm not too hopeful. The fact is, I live better under communism. New York Times, 3/3/1991. An elderly Polish woman, reduced to 1 Red Cross meal a day. Quote, I'm not red, but I have to say life for poor people was better before. Now things are good for businessmen and not good for us poor. New York Times, 3/17/1991. One East German woman commented that the West German women's movement was only beginning to fight for, quote, what we already had here. We took it for granted because of the socialist system. Now we realize what we lost. Los Angeles Times, 8/6/1991. Anti-communist dissidents who labored hard to overthrow the GDR were soon voicing their disappointments about German reunification. One noted Lutheran clergyman commented, quote, "We fell into the tyranny of money. The way wealth is distributed in this society, capitalist Germany, is something I find very hard to take." Another Lutheran pastor said, quote, "We East Germans had no real picture of what life was like in the West. We had no idea how competitive it would be. Unabashed greed and economic power are the levers that move this society. The spiritual values that are essential to human happiness are being lost or made to seem trivial. Everything is buy, earn, sell." Unquote. New York Times, 5/26/1996. Maureen Orth asked the first woman she met in a market if her life had changed in the last 2 years, and the woman burst into tears. She was 58 years old, had worked 40 years in a potato factory, and now could not afford most of the foods in the market. Quote, "It's not life, it's just existence," she said. Vanity Fair, 9/1994. Orth interviewed the chief of a hospital department in Moscow, who said, quote, "Life was different 2 years ago. I was a human being. Now he had to chauffeur people around for extra income. What about the new freedoms?" "Freedom for what?" he responded. "Freedom to buy a pornographic magazine?" In a similar vein, former GDR defense minister Heinz Kessler commented, quote, "Sure, I hear about the new freedom that people are enjoying in Eastern Europe, but how do you define freedom? Millions of people in Eastern Europe are now free from employment, free from safe streets, free from healthcare, free from Social Security." New York Times, 7/20/1996. Do people in the East want the free market? Opinion polls taken in late 1993 in Russia showed only 27% of all respondents supported a market economy. By large majorities, people believe that state control over prices and over private business is useful, and that the state should provide everyone with a job and never tolerate unemployment. No, communist Russia wasn't closed off. In Poland, 92% wanted to keep the state welfare system, and lopsided majorities wanted to retain subsidizing housing and food and return to full employment. Monthly Review, 12/1994. Most people here, reports the New York Times Moscow correspondent in 6/23/1996, are suspicious of private property. Wonder what was so bad about a system that supplied healthcare at low cost from birth to death, and hope that prices are once again reined in by the government. Unquote. One report from Russia describes a bitter electorate, which has found life under a Democrat, meaning Yeltsin, worse than under the now departed communists. New York Times, 12/18/1991. A report from Warsaw refers to the free market economic transformation that most Poles no longer support. Washington Post, 12/15/1991. People's biggest fears are inflation, unemployment, crime, and pollution. State socialism, the system that did not work, provided everyone with some measure of security. Free market capitalism, the system that works, brought a free falling economy, financial plunder, deteriorating social conditions, and mass suffering. In reaction, Eastern European voters had been returning communists to office to preside over the ruin and wreckage of broken nations. By 1996, former communists and their allies had won significant victories in Russia, Bulgaria, Poland, Hungary, Lithuania, Estonia, sometimes emerging as the strongest blocs in their respective parliaments. This was achieved in the face of the same intimidations, police harassments, monetary disadvantages, restrictive ballot access, media shutout, and fraudulent vote counts that confronted leftist parties in most democratic capitalist countries. When the first anti-communist upheavals began in Eastern Europe in 1989, there were those on the left who said that if the people in those countries discovered they didn't like the free market system, they could always return to some variant of socialism. As I argued at that time, this was hardly a realistic view. Capitalism is not just an economic system, but an entire social order. Once it takes hold, it is not voted out of existence by electing socialists or communists. They may occupy office, but the wealth of the nation, the basic property relations, organic law, financial system, and debt structure, along with the national media, police power, and state institutions have all been fundamentally restructured. The resources needed for social programs and full employment have been pilfered or completely obliterated, as have monetary reserves, markets, and natural resources. A few years of untrammeled free market marauding has left these nations at the point of no foreseeable return. The belief propagated by the free market reformers is that the transition from socialism to capitalism can only be made through a vast private accumulation of capital. The hardship inflicted by such privatization supposedly is only temporary. The truth is, nations get stuck in that temporary stage for centuries. One need only look at Latin America. Like other third world nations, the former communist countries are likely to remain in poverty indefinitely, so that a privileged few may continue to enjoy greater and greater opulence at the expense of the many. To secure that arrangement, the corporate class will resort to every known manipulation and repression against democratic resurgence. In these endeavors, they will have the expert assistance of international capital, the CIA, and other agencies of state capitalist dominion. According to Noam Chomsky, communism was a monstrosity, quote unquote, and the collapse of tyranny in Eastern Europe and Russia is an occasion for rejoicing for anyone who values freedom and human dignity, unquote. Again, Noam Chomsky. I treasure freedom and human dignity, yet find no occasion for rejoicing. The post-communist societies do not represent a net gain for such values. If anything, the breakup of the communist states has brought a colossal victory for global capitalism and imperialism, with its correlative increase in human misery, and the historic setback for revolutionary liberation struggles everywhere. There will be harder times ahead, as the fate of Panama and Iraq have indicated. The breakup also means a net loss of global pluralism and more intensive socioeconomic inequality in the world. The peoples of Eastern Europe believed they were going to keep all the social gains they had enjoyed under communism, while adding on all the consumerism of the West. Many of their grievances about existing socialism were justified, but the romanticized image of the capitalist West was not. They had to learn the hard way. Expecting to advance from second world to first world status, they have been rammed down into the third world, ending up like capitalist Indonesia, Mexico, Zaire, and Turkey. They wanted it all and have been left with almost nothing. Here you go. That marks the end of today's Black Shirts and Reds reading. free market paradise has gone east. On Thursday, we will read this next chapter, which will be chapter 8, The End of Marxism?